Okay, today we're going to talk about, we're going to the next section of this course, which is more on software development. We're going to talk about APIs and abstractions. Give you some background. I like giving you a sort of a 10,000 foot view first. So up until this point, we've been talking about abstractions for the infrastructure. We're talking about machines at the lowest level and routes and network addresses and then operating systems and virtual machines. And then we sort of wanted to abstract all of that stuff out, and so we're now doing these platform as a service kinds of abstractions for the underlying infrastructure. And that brought us all the way up to where we are now. And so we're at sort of a modern cloud development paradigm, and so this is where all these cloud platforms sit. They try and abstract out the infrastructure. But what about the applications themselves, the programming experience itself? That's what we're going to talk about next. And so we're going to do, obviously we only have like a week or two to do this, so it's not going to be very comprehensive. But we're going to look at sort of what is being developed to make your job as a software developer easy. How do you add more functionality to whatever app you want to build in as short a time as possible? And so we have a very short time, so this is why this is being covered. So some examples so far of how software packaging and abstractions have made your life easier. So Flask, it's sort of like the April Fool's joke for web frameworks, yet it still provides you an abstraction of routes, of being able to speak HTTP, of all of these things that you don't have to program anymore. And so if you went to school, when I went to school, you would have to program all of this in C. And then you're basically what you would, my first programs as a computer science student were much closer to Hello World than what you're doing right now. It was that basic. And because as a discipline, we keep layering functionality on top of the lower level stuff, you don't have to program the programs that I was forced to program, which were pretty horrible actually. So for example, no need to look at the underlying network socket. You can program right over HTTP, use cookies directly rather than programming them. It's all there for you. Okay. So historically, we've seen this happen a lot. I don't know why this thing keeps falling. So if you go back to the 90s, before a lot of our applications, especially on the back end, well, both the back end and the front end, they were all written in Unix. And then when Microsoft sort of released Windows NT and their Windows 95, you see that all of the shift in software development went to the client, and Microsoft really focused on making the developer experience really seamless, and that allowed developers to get all sorts of productivity to build all sorts of new apps. So that was their strategy. Steve Ballmer had this. He went up to one of these developer conferences, and all he did was shout, "Developers, developers, developers." That was their whole push. And if you go after the developers and they build a lot of cool stuff on your platform's going to win. And clearly, the Microsoft platform won in the 90s. Almost everybody, after they got their CS degree, was learning the Windows SDK. And so this was something they were trying to push into schools. We never adopted it in any place that I was at, but they really wanted people to learn the development environment on Windows. But 20 years later, this was from last year, Microsoft Windows died and nobody cared. And this shows the weakness of people moving away from Windows SDK development. And so why did this happen? What happened between the 20 years from the first plot and this? Well, basically what happened, this is a graph that shows mobile happened and web happened to Microsoft. And it basically made it so that their development environment was no longer something that could build the applications that people wanted. People wanted networked applications. They didn't need Microsoft Windows, the SDK, to help them build that. They needed something else. So now what we have is a bunch of mobile apps on the front end, so Android and iOS SDKs, Some of our courses have you do Android development. So that is now the newer, the front line of development. And then for server apps, we have all these frameworks being developed on sort of the front end, I guess, front end web apps, I should say. So all of these frameworks for doing really rich experiences on the client that don't involve the Windows SDK. So that's where another ecosystem has popped up. And then you could actually do both. So a lot of the newer frameworks are trying to unify both mobile and desktop web experiences. And this is where you would have React Native and Flutter, trying to get you one coding experience that you can then repackage seamlessly into a mobile form factor and a full-on desktop form factor. So that's where people are. If you're looking to get a job, you wouldn't be learning the Windows SDK. You would be doing this kind of stuff because that's what people are moving towards. Meanwhile, a similar thing happened on the back end. We started building all of these server-side frameworks for handling web server traffic and handling data on the back end. So on the back end for web, you have Python, Django, Spring for Java. You have all of these server infrastructures. For the data piece on the back end, you have different caches. You have message queues. We talked about both of these already in this class. You have your back-end databases, which is what your labs are. And people are building things around that software. And now, going forward, we're seeing a huge shift to software as a service, where you're not running anything on your sort of server system. You're basically accessing services over the network. You're using network APIs to add functionality to your program, which is what your final project is going to be. How can I integrate other functionality via a rich API that they export and add something to my web app? So that's what we're doing. And this is an exponential growth of the number of public REST APIs that are available for you to use to build all your cool apps in this class. So this is a good resource if you're looking for some ideas. RapidAPI.com has a pretty good list of, I think they label whether or not the thing is free, or if you have to create a paid account and register a credit card to get an API key. I don't want you to have to register a credit card. There's lots of free APIs out there for you to use for your project. Okay, so on Google Cloud, if you look at this number, there's like almost 200 different API groups on Google Cloud. You just go into the API library and you can see. So the Maps API, for example, that might come in handy for your project. All you have to do is navigate that thing and then click on the button and see the kinds of features that API exports, and then you'll just directly integrate that functionality into your web app. So the ones that we'll be doing out of here, you already did the knowledge graph one. We're also going to do a lot of the machine learning ones. That'll be the second half of this class. So the voice and the image analysis and the video analysis is something that we're going to have you do. There are also a ton of APIs externally. So payment sites are a popular one that you would integrate into your web app. So PayPal and Venmo have a REST API for you to create an account and for you to integrate the payment process into your site for your users. Social media has a rich set of APIs that you can build your web app around and then be able to programmatically insert and read stuff from social media. There's another rich set of APIs for messaging. So there are businesses that want to be able to message their clients, and their clients are using WhatsApp, they're using SMS, they're using Slack, they're using all these different modes. And so what you can do is you can build this middleware. So Twilio and Nexmo are building middleware so that you give your customer a single messaging interface, and then based on what the client is using, it'll just send that message to whatever platform they're reading their messages from. And that's how you can do, this is sort of customer relations management software that is something you can integrate into your web app if you choose. This is an example up here of Twilio. So they're messaging people over Twitter, Facebook Messenger, SMS, Slack, and these sorts of things. Okay, another interesting set of APIs are the Internet of Things APIs. So LIFX has these internet-connected light bulbs that are integrated with things like the Echo, so that you can send that thing commands to turn itself on and off. The way you access these things are through REST APIs. So you register the device with one of these services. So this is Google Cloud's IoT Core, and this is AWS's IoT Core. And then they will export basically a REST API for you to access this light bulb so that you can turn it on and off. And then you can, so 2 terms ago, I had somebody do an image. I think what he did is like submit an image to my Google Vision, my web app. I'll see what the complementary colors are to that image, and I'll allow you to change the shade of my LIFX light bulb in my house. And then he had a webcam pointed at the thing. So you're like, oh yeah, I actually changed your light. And I'm like, well, do you shut that off at all? Because he was like, yeah, it's only from like 10 to 5 that you could do it. But basically all of his friends were like changing the color of his light bulb. So then he knew, yeah. So you could do something like that. That's pretty creative in terms of an API integration for your project. One that was really popular, I think 2 summers ago, we did a recipe site. So you did a bubble tea site. This one was a recipe site. And so something like the Nutritionix API, you can give it some search terms, and it will return you like the calorie count, the macronutrient breakdown of your ingredients, and all sorts of other parts related to food. Here's one that's spoonacular. If you ask Alexa, for example, what is the vitamin A content in 2 cups of sugar, then what it will do is it'll go into the ingredients API and query the ingredients API and give you the result. If you say, Alexa, what is a good recipe for pulled pork, and then it will go into the recipes API. So these are things that you would you could integrate into your site if you wanted to. And so what I'm going to talk about next is you got all these rich APIs that are out there. How do you integrate all of that stuff into your web app is the next thing. So the most common way is with Python packages. And this is if they exist. And there's also JavaScript packages, but because your web app is in Python, I'm going to talk about the Python packages. So PyPy is the Python package index. And almost all of these APIs, the companies that are behind them will create a Python package to integrate with a popular programming language. They'll try and support every popular programming language because their business model is to charge people on API requests over a certain amount. So the easier that they make it for developers to build really cool apps, the more money they make. And so it's the same idea as what Windows was way back when. If I make the developer experience really seamless, they'll build more stuff and then I'll get more money. So that's the idea. And I'm going to show you a bunch of code examples here. One of the things that I'm going to show you is that an API key is going to be stuck in the code itself. That's for simplicity, but you should never do that in a production site where it's charging your credit card for. It's just bad practice, but I just want to make, for the code examples, this is just for clarity. But I just wanted to put that there because it hurt me to leave some of the code in there. I didn't get a chance to fix all of them. Here's an example of Giphy. So how many of you know what Giphy is? Okay, so this is a site that gives you give it a search term, and it gives you an animated GIF that's like a meme that is related to your search term. And so it's as simple as getting an API, getting an account on Giphy. So this is a free account that you can get. And I think it's like you get 1,000 queries a month before you have to start paying. So it's like, yeah, unless your app is really popular, you'll be fine. But like you just get an API key, and then this is how simple it is. You import the package. You say, give me an instance of the API, and then I'm going to use that instance to do a search. This GIF search get is a function in the package. I'll provide the API key and then the search term. So I'm going to search for Giphies that are related to clapbacks. I want only a single one, rated G, the English, and then I want the return to be in JSON. So I'm going to specify how I want the data back, and then I'll just print the embedded URL. So can anyone guess what this one turned out into? What would be the number one hit for clapback? Anyone guess? No one? It's this one. That's the number one result. So yeah, you could put that in your site with just a simple set. Well, you'd have to do the embed. You'd have to actually take that URL, embed it in your site. Okay, here's another one. This is Spotify, which is basically Spotify done in Python. A little more complicated. You have to specify your ID and the key associated with your account, so you can get that at developer.spotify.com. And then you instantiate your credentials, and then you instantiate the Spotify client with those credentials, and then all you do is search it. So Spotify.search, this is the search term Foo Fighters. I'm looking for the top playlists for Foo Fighters, and then I'm just going to go and pull out the songs that are part of this playlist, as an example. Okay, another way of accessing APIs, and I'm showing you this because you've already seen this. It's using the automatic generation features of Python to be able to build your own Python package based on an API. And this is the cleaner way of doing these things, these API building packages. So basically what they do is they parse a REST API specification. So if you're going to put up a REST API, you can provide a specification that describes everything that your API supports. All of the data types for the parameters for your calls, all of the return values and their types, and what these building packages will do is it'll wrap the Python code around it so that you can then use it directly in your program. So I'll show you some examples. This is the YouTube API. YouTube has a regular Python package that you could use, but it also does it this way too. So it actually uses the API client discovery. So that's part of this package, Google API Python client. And then what you do is from this thing, you import the building piece. And then you say, you know, I want to build an API. I want to build the YouTube API, and I want to use, this is the service name, which is YouTube. This is the API version I want to build. So the API has multiple versions. You want version 3. And this is my developer key. And it returns you an object, YouTube, that you can then invoke using regular Python to query. So this builds the interface to the REST API, and then you can just use it directly. So here on the next line, I say I want to use that API, and I want to search. And I want to go through the search. I want to list all of the videos that are associated with Grumpy Cat. And then this will return in the search response a list of items, and then I can basically go through there and get all of the titles and the URLs from it. Okay? A lot of the Google APIs can be accessed this way, if you'd like. One of the nice things about doing it this way is that it automatically gets you gRPC as the transfer back and forth between the client and the server. So it saves you bits, if you're being charged for them at least. Okay, here's the knowledge graph API. I think this was in your Cloud Functions one, where you pull it from you get a developer key, you build the API, the knowledge graph API, just like the previous one, and then you call search on it for Portland State University, and then you execute it and then print out the results. Okay, the other way of accessing a REST API is directly through HTTP using Python requests. So if you have done A3 password, so in the Thunder CTF, I have you go to try this API out. What that does is it gives you a UI that allows you to hit the REST interface. And this is very similar to basically doing the same thing in Python. Directly access REST using an HTTP request. So almost all languages will have some kind of support for hitting HTTP or URLs. And typically, these things support doing gets and posts to API endpoints with JSON as the carrier. So you're submitting your form elements as JSON and you're getting the results back as JSON, and then your application will just unpackage the JSON and use it. I prefer Python requests, and that's what all these examples use. And I think most people are using Python requests. I don't see URL lib being used much at all. So this might be code that you might be interested in. This is the Google Places API. And this is an example that shows how you can hit the API using REST and Python. So as before, so this is bad practice. My API key is sitting here in the file system. I pull the search from the form. So this is a post of a form. I haven't shown you the HTML for this, but you pull the search value from the form, and then you craft the endpoint. So the endpoint has a URL that looks like this. Excuse me. The location, maybe you can pull this from the form, but I've hard-coded the location that I want to do the search. And then I hard-code the variable that I'm looking for, which is a restaurant. And then I can hit the API endpoint using a GET request. So request.get just takes a URL, and then it just pulls the URL and then adds the location, the type, the keyword, and then my API key. And then I'll get back a JSON object. And then I can use requests JSON parsing function to pull out a dictionary. And then what I'm given back here is a dictionary that I can then send to some HTML template to render the results of that request. Are there questions about this code when you take a look at it? Okay. I think it's just helpful to just read the code and make sure you understand all the pieces. And then if you don't understand any particular piece, let me know. Post it on the Slack channel. The other thing that would be helpful is you can actually interactively run these Python commands from the Python interpreter itself. And this is what your lab is going to be. Because when you're debugging your project, you're going to want to make sure that you can get the data to and from the API first. And that's typically best done using interactive Python, doing this kind of stuff. Okay, here's another example of the Knowledge Graph API using an HTTP request rather than the Python package. So again, I import requests, and I import my knowledge key. I set my term. I format there's an F string that's got the URL, and then embedded in this URL is the query term that I pull from up here, and the API key that I pull from up there. And then I do a request.get on that URL string. I get the response, and I convert it into a dictionary from JSON. So it's really simple to get at these endpoints. Here's an example for Yelp. This might come in handy. URL endpoint is defined. Some of these APIs require you to supply a bearer token. So they ask you for the API key rather than in the get or the post parameters. They say, no, I want you to put it in the authorization field. And so what you're going to have to do is when you go to an API, every API will do the authorization differently. You have to read the documentation. You have to figure out what are the key, like how do you want the API key to validate that I am, this app is from me. And so this is where you'll do a little bit of digging on the service end and usually all of these sites will have the canonical example. This is how you integrate it in requests or in Python. So just be aware of that. Yelp is doing this using a bearer. This is similar to your Thunder CTF stuff, which is using the bearer tokens. Okay, I think it's helpful to see these things side by side. So here is both a Python version and a requests version of the exact same thing. So in the above, you're using the geocode part of Google Maps. And then what you're doing is you're going to import the Python package Google Maps. You're going to create a client with the API key. You're going to say, this is the query I want to run. And then I say, give me the geocoded results of that query. And then from this result, I can index this and get all the addresses. So all of the addresses of Mocha Tea House in Portland get returned, and I get a list of those things as a result. The other way I could do this is I could use the REST API. I import requests, I import JSON, get my API key, I have my search term, which is the exact same thing, and then I can format a GET request that's got the explicit endpoint here. and then I can format into this query, this address over here, the query name and then the API key. And this does exactly the same thing using requests. And it doesn't matter to me which way you use it. Just find a way to get the data is all I care about, is the object of the project. Okay, and then I load the JSON to get a dictionary. This is just I could have done response resp.json to get the dictionary, but in this case, there's also this. I can use this JSON library and just do a JSON loads. There's multiple ways of getting a dictionary out of JSON, as it turns out. Okay, are there questions about the code example here? Different ways of quoting strings in Python. So if you have a string that either has single quotes or double quotes in it, it's a pain in the neck to have to escape everything out. And so Python, that's right, Python allows you to do this triple quote notation, and it's rare that your actual payload, your string, has triple quotes in it. And so this is one way. So I could have put single quotes anywhere through this URL, and then I wouldn't have needed to escape that. So yeah. Here's an example. So again, Nutritionix, you can access either through the Python packages. This is sort of, I mean, I think the thing on the bottom is preferred because any of the updates to the API, you can basically get very quickly in your code that uses the endpoint. It's a matter of just changing the parameters. It's harder to do this where you're having to rely on someone to upload a new version into the Python package repository. So typically, if you can, I would try and do this first before I would do this. This is actually simpler initially, but if you want to keep up to date with the API, you'd probably want to do this on the bottom, just as an aside. Okay, so here's an example of the Nutritionix API. You get your account ID and your API key from the environment. You instantiate the client, and then you just search. And you give it the query term, which recipe are you looking for? You want 3 of them, and then you hit the API that way. This is a little more verbose. You have the endpoint. You have a way of accessing the endpoint. So in this case, they want the credentials as HTTP headers. And so the reason I put this in here is because this is how you create HTTP headers. This is going to give you client HTTP request headers when you then do this request.post. So here, it takes it as a dictionary. String is a key, string as the value, and then it will format an HTTP header that's got that colon that in the HTTP request header lines for the request. And this is just the way Nutritionix wants you to present your credentials. And then this particular API endpoint also wants that you submit your query as post data. So on the previous ones, we were using get, right? I'm going to pull the request parameters off of the get payload. In this case, Nutritionix wants you to do a post, and moreover, when you do the post, it wants a JSON object as your post query. And so application in HTML, you can specify the format of your post data. You can say URL form encoded, or you can say application JSON. In this particular case, you're hitting an API that wants JSON. And so the way to do this is you do a request.post on the URL, you set the headers to what these headers were, and then you say, I'm going to specify the JSON as this dictionary. And then what it'll do, this thing will automatically turn this dictionary into the JSON formatted version of it. And dictionaries and JSON aren't equivalent, so you have to do this translation on the client. And hopefully you've given it a dictionary that's JSON compliant, otherwise you'll get an error out of this. And then you can parse the response to get all the ingredients. Okay? Are there questions about what I've just shown you? So these are things you could probably integrate into your app pretty easily. Okay, so looking ahead, I'm going to show you how to use some of the machine learning APIs on Google Cloud. And then I'm going to transition next week to backend as a service in terms of software abstractions. Before I do the machine learning API stuff, I want to talk about the lab associated with the API stuff. And I think it's best to do that right now. So the APIs lab, this is the one and only one. So we're back to the guest book. This is the last guest book one, I think. So you'll be done with the guest book after this, hopefully. So before, we had all of these different ways to ship our web app, but we still had the web app rendering on the back end. And so this was done with Flask using Jinja, and then the templates are stored on the server, and they return HTML. But if you recall, way back in the web dev lecture, we talked about all of this stuff shifting to the client. What a single page application does is it takes this static HTML and JavaScript and CSS, ships one package to the client, and then all the client does to interact with your service is to make REST API requests that will dynamically update the HTML on the front end. So there is no Flask running on the back end, and there is no Jinja template running on the back end. You're pre-shipping the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and all it's doing, it's not ever reloading your app from the server, it's just interacting with your REST API. And this is the architecture that all these web apps are doing now. Like when you go to Gmail, you never have to switch a page, right? Like you're always within their little app, and it's doing REST API calls to get your messages to and from the back end. And so this lab is taking the guest book code, creating a REST API to both list the entries and insert the entries, and then you could, if you wanted to, build this sort of single-page app on the front end to access the back-end data. So we're going to create a REST API that allows you direct access to the guest book backend. So basically the backend that has the data store. You're going to be able to create an API that allows people to modify that data store backend directly. So to do this, you're going to have to do a git pull. This code, if you haven't done a pull on the course repository recently, do a pull, and you should get this directory. So what we're going to use Cloud Functions to implement a REST API for our guest book in this lab. And then if you look at the Cloud Function, it does require Flask because to do the routing and then Cloud Data Store. But you'll see that it's not going to use the Jinja stuff anymore. And then like the other ones before, you're going to have to point your Cloud Function to your data store, your project ID's data store. Okay. So this is your Cloud Function. It's in main.py. It's a single function. And it supports two methods. It supports a get and a post. So this is the endpoint. The endpoint I'm going to create is GB. And like before, I import GB model in JSON. This is the code for the get. So I pull the model out. And if the request method is a get, I know I'm going to dump the entire backend. And so this code is similar to what you had before. I'm going to create a list of dictionaries for all of the entries in my backend. And then I'm going to create a JSON object to pass back. And so in this case, I'm going to create an integer index so that it's like, it's enumerated. That's what this thing does. It establishes a key that's basically a number. And then it sends back every single row as a dictionary. So that's the get. And then, let me see here. And then what I do is from this dictionary, I just turn this into JSON, and then I use Flask's make response to send this thing back as a JSON object. So this is how I'm returning JSON, and then of course, I have to set the content type of what I'm returning as application./JSON, just to let the browser know that that's what I'm sending back to it. And then I can return this response with a code of 200, which means this is the HTTP code that I send back, and it says, okay. So this is my API endpoint for getting you're getting all of the entries in the guest book as a JSON object. A single JSON object is what's going on here. This is the post method for doing the same thing. So if it's a post, then you're going to check to make sure that the content type is a JSON object. So this is an API that's expecting you to send it JSON. And then in your JSON, Oh, the indentation's all messed up. I'll have to fix that. You're basically going to get the dictionary from a JSON object, which is what this is doing, to get the JSON for the form fields. And then for this, you're going to make sure that your JSON gives you a dictionary after it's parsed that has the name, email, and message. So this is what we're going to do to insert an entry into the guest book. We're going to take a post that has a JSON object that has these fields in it, and then we're going to do a model.insert of those three things. And that'll insert that entry into our guest book backend. I'll raise an error if one of those three things is missing. Okay, then what I'm going to do for this one, I'm going to make a response that's basically going to echo the entry that you had me add, is this. And then I will set the content type again to application/JSON. I'll return that response. Actually, it should have been, I should have returned the response. And then I'm going to give you a 201, which is added. This is the HTTP code that you have added an entry. I think I should have done response there instead of request_JSON. Huh. I don't know why that worked then. All right. Okay, so what I'm going to have you do is then you're going to deploy this cloud function in Cloud Shell. And this is the command to do it. You're specifying the endpoint that you're going to deploy, the runtime, and you're going to say, I'm going to need an HTTP trigger, so that will be my URL endpoint. I'm going to allow unauthenticated invocations, as I did before. You're going to show the HTTPS trigger after the deployment, and this is going to be what the subsequent slides refer to as API endpoint. And then this is what you'll get. So you'll get this thing, you'll get the trigger, you'll see this thing up in the console, and then what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you click on this function, and when you click on this function, you can figure out the amount of RAM that's allocated to the function, what's the size of the container that's being used to run the function. What I want you to do after you click on the function, you can click on the trigger and then find the URL. I want you to click on this to see your dictionary, your JSON, your guestbook dictionary coming back, because this will hit your endpoint with a GET request. And then you can see up here the testing tab. The testing tab allows you to test your API. So in this case, you're going to send it this JSON, and this is going to insert these entries into the guestbook. And so when you give it this JSON and you say test this function, it will return this JSON back, because that's how we programmed the API endpoint, to return whatever got added. I want you to add a specific message to this, and then click on test this function and then show the output. And then this should show up in your guestbook as an added entry. I then want you to add another entry from the Python interpreter using one of the requests mechanism. So in Cloud Shell, I want you to bring up the interpreter. I want you to import requests. And I want you to first do request.get on the API endpoint to get the dictionary back, the guestbook entries. And then I want you in Python to get all the data types. I want the status code, the headers, the response text, and all of their data types, because this is what you're going to need to do to debug your REST API integrations. If something goes wrong and you don't know where it's going wrong at, these are the tools that you can use to figure out, oh, this is a different type. I'm getting something, a type of, the object that I'm getting sent back is a different type than what I'm expecting, and then you can debug your app this way. Or the thing is down, like the status code, it might give me an unauthorized status code, in which case I have a problem with my credentials. So this is really important when you are debugging your integration to run through these commands so that you understand how to debug your integration. Okay. And then I want you to craft a dictionary. So this is getting the guestbook. The next thing is I want you to use the interpreter to insert an entry into the guestbook backend. So for this, you import JSON. You create a dictionary with the keys name, email, and message, because the thing is wanting a JSON object on the post. So that's the dictionary. This is a way of creating a dictionary from the interpreter and in Python. And then I want you to do the post of that entry, and then you can specify the JSON keyword argument that will turn this dictionary into the equivalent JSON. And then this gets posted to that endpoint, and this should add an entry into your guestbook. Okay, so and then same as before, show the response status, the response headers, and the text. And then I want you to revisit the guestbook API to show the new entries, but then I want you to bring up any version of the guestbook that you have run in this class. I think the easiest thing to do is to do the dev app server and then go to v4 and type python app.py and then just hit that thing to show the entry in the actual in a server rendered guestbook as the final one. And then I'm going to have you just delete you can if you want to. The thing isn't going to cost you much to run though. Okay, so I'm going to take a 5-minute break and then talk about ML APIs next.